All right, welcome everyone to CDCon. I am Tara Hernandez, Senior Engineering Manager at Google Cloud, and I am incredibly pleased to be able to have this amazing conversation with Nicole Forsgren, author of Accelerate, that if you all haven't read it yet, go read it now. Also recently the author of a new research paper that we're about to start talking about, and she is a partner research manager at Microsoft Research. Welcome, Nicole.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited.
I'm so excited.
I would be more excited if we were doing this in person someday soon.
Someday soon, we'll be back to doing these things in person over drinks, solving all technologies, industries problems. With a little icebreaker to start out, let's start with a fun fact about you that maybe no one knows except maybe your deepest, closest friends and family.
Yes. I was on a competitive jump rope team in the 5th grade.
Like double dutch kind of competitive, so like flips and
and jump rope inside of double dutch, and tricks in jump rope inside of double dutch. Listen, I'm from Idaho. We didn't have much to do.
Much else to do, especially when it wasn't ski season. All right, I respect
yes.
So let's talk about this most recent paper, which is why probably you have a job, partner research manager at Microsoft Research. You do a lot of research around how things run in tech. Obviously, most of us are familiar with State of DevOps report and the DORA work, but now we have SPACE, which is research that is around developer productivity and satisfaction specifically. And it's something that when you read the paper, which we'll have a link attached for anyone interested, it seemed like it was in particular around the opportunity that COVID presented to kind of create a laboratory, if you will. But where did this idea come from? And the group that came together to write this paper, how did that all come about?
I love this question. And it's interesting because it's something that I've been thinking about for a few years, right? So, and I love that you kind of mentioned, State of DevOps and DORA, and we've been thinking about a bunch of this for years. And how do we think about metrics? How do we think about measurement? How do we think about best practices? If we want to, dig up some of my old talks, I've been thinking about, and I've been talking about metrics and frameworks and using metrics intention. If we think about the 4 key metrics, these are speed and stability, and we use metrics intention. And many times people ask me for guidance and best practices and how do we measure things. And now, especially now, that I've been doing more work, and when I joined GitHub, we started digging into more things around productivity. They would say, well, how do we do this? And is there one metric that matters? And how do we do this? And I'm like, first of all, there's never going to be one metric that matters, because that leads to problems, right? Because we'll overcorrect, we'll overcompensate. Metrics change behavior, they change incentives. And we will often have the same type of best practices or general guidelines around how we want to have 2 to 3 metrics around the same dimension that we'll want to be balanced. Given that framework, given that context, when I was at GitHub, I reached out to a handful of my colleagues at MSR and I said, I've been thinking about this. I've got this in my head. I know there's more than activity, just counts, right? Because everyone's thinking about, like, we all know lines of code is trash, right? But we're like, everyone thinks about lines of code or number of commits or number of PRs or number. That's an activity metric. And I said, but I know there's going to be more, right? I always think about efficiency and flow, a flow metric. Did I get a lot done? Was I not interrupted? We also know there's communication and collaboration, because there's so much great work around invisible work, going back to Lucy Suchman's work. And I said, satisfaction and well-being. So I kind of walked into it with at least kind of a rough idea. And I reached out to people who've been studying this for at least a decade, reached out to 2 or 3. A couple of them said, oh, but then there's this person I've been working with. Can we also pull in this person? I'm so fortunate.
You have a party.
Oh my gosh, it was like the best nerd party ever. We ended up having this weekly meeting where we kind of pulled together this paper and this wealth of experience and expertise, and we ended up coming up with the 5, right? It was satisfaction and well-being, performance, kind of through the system. What are the outcomes through the system? activity, communication, collaboration, and efficiency and flow. And then, the structure of the paper came out where we're like, well, let's make sure we discuss myths and misconceptions to help motivate this paper. What are some examples? What are some of the failure modes? And what are some of the suggestions that we give? And because we had all been studying this and talking about it for about a decade, we aligned on so many things, but we had also seen kind of different corners around it. And it may be one of my favorite papers. I can't say that. I love all my babies, right? There are no ugly babies, but I really, really love the paper, and it's been resonating so well. I'm super excited about it.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the myths and misconceptions. I think one of the things that was really valuable about Accelerate was talking about the capabilities, and then seeing out of that what are the clear anti-patterns that you want to try to avoid, because there was so much data to kind of show that. So can we talk a little bit about of the myths and misconceptions that you talk about in your paper, what do you think are the most prevalent or perhaps the most damaging, or maybe those were the same?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few. So for sure, I already talked about it, that there's one metric that matters. And that one's really problematic. And we end up seeing it so often in terms of activity, right? Like I'm going to look at least by now, most people are like, lines of code is trash, right? Or very problematic. But then people will say, well, number of commits, or number of pull requests, or number of something. But what ends up happening is not only do you miss the complexity of what is development, and also not just development, check out the bottom of the paper, we have a sidebar on SRE, right? Because productivity, this framework, in discussing it and developing it, the framework captures many different types of productivity, which is, I think, the superpower behind it. I love it so much. But when we only talk about one thing, we miss the complexity, we miss the nuance, we miss several other things that contribute to other things that are important. We have early data showing that one-on-ones are predictive of active time coding, because we need this brain power, we need discussion time, we need communication time. We also know things like time spent in design review makes for better code, because otherwise you're just piling on technical debt, right? So if we don't think very carefully about how we want to guide and create better decisions, this can be problematic, right? That's the other thing, right? Like, what's the decision you're aiming for? If you just pick a random number out of the air, that doesn't give you actionable advice. That doesn't help you guide decisions. There's also this idea that you can buy productivity. You can just purchase something. And I want to say that I'm going to say it and someone's going to take this out of context. And when you do, I'm going to find you on Twitter and I'm going to yell at you. The thing that I will say is a yes, is that we can make smart purchase decisions to help productivity, but I'm not going to call it productivity. I'm going to say the developer experience. A superior developer experience can be helped with good tooling and good automation. And by that, I mean, how can we reduce friction? How can we make it easier to code? How can we make it easier to spin up or provision environments? How can we make it easier to search and find code, subject matter experts, information? How can we make it easier to understand and discover the implications of the code that we use, right? Is this going to cause dependency problems? Listen, if we can throw money at those problems, absolutely do it. But that's developer experience. That's not just like I can buy a thing and it clicks and it's done, and then I expect to like squeeze blood out of a rock. No, that's not a thing, because that's one portion of it. And then we also need to be thinking about creating and curating and fostering the rest of the developer experience. How do we help and surface communication? How do we help and create better efficiency and flow? How do we think about performance through the system?
Well, and this brings up a great point. There's a corresponding anti-pattern about, can you buy a solution that does all of this? No. So when someone tries to sell you that, be suspicious. It kind of goes along with, do you do DevOps by hiring a DevOps team, right? That's which, schools of thought, but it's the same kind of thing. It's like you're throwing money in the wrong direction, right? In this case, resources. And overall, there's, I think, also productivity myths. We talk about developer velocity or efficiency. you're also talking about capacity, right? And so the amount of time, recognizing the amount of time you're actually able to be heads down doing work. You see maybe you're a Scrum Master and you're thinking, well, 80% because we're going to be very efficient about how the developers are isolated, right? But the reality is it's probably not that much time. I think 60% even is aggressive, and you're thinking maybe 40 or 50 is more accurate based on what you saw as far as accounting for things like meetings, code reviews, design work, all of that other type of stuff that goes into this overall experience.
Yeah, when you're, a reasonable rule of thumb is that in a good scenario, 50% is nice, right? Because you've got design reviews, you've got code reviews, you're dealing with technical debt and keep the lights on work. Also, realize every time you ship something, you're also going to be thinking about maintaining it, whether you're maintaining that or you're dealing with additional technical debt or you're dealing with additional architectural considerations.
Right. How many support tails are there?
Right. How many support tails are there? In just to keep the lights on situation, you're probably still dealing with like at a minimum 80% time, right? Because you have unplanned work that comes back to you. Because I mean, I'm sure we all submit code and it works perfectly the first time. We never have anything come back. Clearly. Obviously.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. And then going back to, I was actually, this is a thought exercise. I think about, DevOps engineers and anti-pattern. I mean, I know what they mean when they say that, but there's also like all of that invisible work. If you can offload all of that invisible work, what would that job description be? Sustaining engineer? I don't know.
Well, so it's interesting, right? Because there are a few pieces to think about here. Because if you could offload all of that invisible work, what would that job description look like? But at the same time, when we think about some of the core DevOps principles and processes, it's all about speeding up those feedback loops, because we want faster feedback. We want those tests to fail as quickly as possible, because then we retain that context in our head. We know what's happening in the code. And I say that because in some ways we want to offload work, but in some ways we don't want to offload that invisible work, because the invisible work of communication, of collaboration, of talking to people is that context that makes us better developers. It's that context that helps us understand and know what's happening in our system, what's happening outside of our system, where the complexity lies, where the system breaks and how the system breaks. And also, the first time we need to solve a problem is a manual process. The second time we solve a problem might be a manual process, and then we automate it away. And then it's a brand new problem again, and it's a brand new process, right? But if we just offload everything, we're actually very bad developers, because suddenly we have no idea about how our systems react, respond.
Context is everything.
It's all gone.
Yeah.
And it's also really interesting that you have mentioned a couple times a DevOps team. Can we just hire a DevOps team and DevOps engineers to handle things? Because there are some places and some situations where I hear people say, I just want to buy a DevOps tool set or tool chain. So sometimes people just they want to try to throw money at different sets of the problem. But either way, it kind of requires everything in both.
Yep. You practice. All right, let's talk about the space framework. So we've got the various categories. Do you think that each part of the framework is equally weighted, or do you think that some have more weight than others?
I'm totally going to do the thing where I'm going to say it depends. I would say that I know I'm the worst.
That's all right.
I would say all are important. Interestingly, I've already had people try to nerd snipe me on Twitter, and I am a pro now, so I just ignore them.
Good.
But in some of the nerd sniping, they have tried to say or claim that I am redefining productivity to include satisfaction and well-being. But I will say that much of the prior research and data doesn't support that assertion that we're redefining or we're rescoping productivity. And here's why. Rescoping it to include satisfaction, well-being, and here's why. We've got well over a decade of research showing that satisfaction is highly, highly correlated to time in IDE, showing that more time in self-perceived and self-asserted productivity is predictive of productivity and well-being, that productivity and well-being is predictive, is in turn predictive of higher productivity. So when it is so highly intertwined, interrelated, intercorrelated with many other productivity measures, including communication and collaboration, I mentioned earlier that one-on-ones end up being predictive of more coding time in many situations. When so many of these different dimensions and factors end up being so highly correlated, I don't think you can say that one is more or less weighted. What I would say is, as we recommend in the paper, having at least, definitely at least two. We recommend three. I could maybe see a case where you'd have two. It would be a stretch. But I would say at least have three and pick them based on what the decision is you're trying to make. What's your goal? What's your decision? What's the context in which you're operating? Now, this isn't like bingo where you have to hit every possible square and like bingo blackout where you're trying to like cover the card in order to win. Now, why not? Listen, people get overwhelmed, right? Like if you tell someone they have to have 472 measures in order to make a good decision, they're gonna like walk away, like they're gonna be done. But if you can give them a handful of measures across at least 3 dimensions, and you can say, this will help us make a better decision, and here's why, they will do better. So can I give an example? I've been ranting for minutes, I care deeply.
Please, I love your example.
Here's a good example that I have seen practically at least 2 or 3 times. So people want more time in code. People also want fast turnaround, peer review turnaround. The interesting thing is many times they're like, well, I'm being blocked on code. I need good turnaround. So when I say, let's have some kind of balance, this is where it comes into play. And then people get very upset because you can't optimize or maximize these 2 metrics, right? Because they'll say, I've had someone say, let's require a 1-hour PR turnaround time. And I'm going to alert people if they don't get those PRs turned around in time.
That sounds absolutely horrifying.
Oh my gosh, it's the worst. Except unless you have a new, eager designer or product manager in charge of PRs, then it sounds amazing. Or someone who's just in charge of that metric in isolation, then it sounds amazing. And so if we think about balancing PR turnaround, and it's very important, right? Because if those PRs are blocking someone else, so let's balance that with time in code, right? Because IDE, time in IDE has been shown to be highly correlated with developer satisfaction. So if we want, we can pull in a developer satisfaction metric. If it's going to be too hard to collect that, now I would suggest including both telemetry and perception measures, but whatever, let's save that fight for another day or another minute. So let's look at coding time or number of commits. Let's say you don't have IDE time, number of commits or pushes or something like that with turnaround time. And then let's also look at something like batching or flow. Perhaps we agree that it happens all at once in the morning or in the afternoon. And so we can balance these because then we're balancing individual and team considerations. That's what we mean when we say that we're looking for some kind of balance and flow. Or maybe you agree that they're open 24 hours so the whole team can see them. You've got around the world or follow the sun coverage.
Right. Well, let's talk about that a little bit. There's a couple things I want to dig back into. One is getting into the flow, so AKA blocking out interrupted time in some interesting way. Do you have data that shows that, you know, some companies will do no meeting Fridays or no meeting Mondays, or, you know, pick a day of the week? Other companies less so, I think, but may try like no meeting mornings. on an ongoing basis. So is there any data that kind of shows how batching that sort of thing can be effective? Presumably you need to have a single system, because you have some people that have no meeting Fridays and other people have no meeting mornings. There's going to be bad intersection availability.
Again, I'll say it depends. And it's kind of unique and particular to the team and to the person, right? Because especially as we've seen over the last year when everything came home, we did see some teams that thrived with no meeting Tuesdays or no meeting Friday, no meeting full days, because they were really able to focus. However, it was very, very disruptive to other folks, depending, for example, if they had to provide childcare, right? It was actually very difficult because suddenly people expected that they would be available for everything, right? Or they had days off and like forced days off, but it was actually pretty difficult for them, because when you had these days off, there were then even implied, if not expected, implied expectations about additional work being done or additional deliverables or turnarounds. So balancing it, at least within the team level, can be really helpful. Now, speaking of that, productivity is personal. Some wonderful work by Ford et al. Coming out of MSR has found that indeed productivity is personal. For some people, work from home has been wonderful. They have been able to control their environment. They've been able to control their workspace. They can manage their interruptions. They can manage their work. They can manage their energy. On the other hand, for some people, work from home really has been a struggle. They see more interruptions. They're really missing that interaction with teams. It's really been kind of tough. And so there really isn't just one. Just one answer. It depends on what your work style is like. It depends on what your personal situation is like. It really is kind of a mix.
So you talked a little bit about performance being evaluated as outcomes rather than output, which I love. And I am definitely a big proponent of never using lines of code. I think it's a terrible metric, unless you're subtracting. I love to see big subtractions, because that usually means you're clearing out cruft. So when you think about that process and metrics, how much does something like OKRs or KPIs really tie in effectively? So often we see those applied kind of in letter of the law rather than spirit of the law applications, and they just become kind of a checkbox and not necessarily informative. Do you have any sort of thoughts or research around that within the context of this framework?
Within the context of this framework, I would say this framework is really meant for things like productivity, but it can roll up very well into things like OKRs. OKRs can be a really wonderful organizational alignment technique, and there's actually some really exciting research happening right now out of some MSR folks, so stay tuned because I think they're writing it up right now. But in terms of organizational alignment, I think it's wonderful. I do love your point that it's very easy to be gamed. Honestly, any metrics can be gamed, right? Anything can be gamed. So I think that the goal is to think about organizational alignment, communication, goals, and how can we think about communicating those goals both within our teams, up and down the organization, and across teams. And what is it that we're trying to communicate, and what is it that we're trying to do? If the point is to make sure that we can just like nail that metric, it's easy to measure, it's easy to hit, it's fine. I mean, I guess it's fine. We can do it. Also, what does that say about the organization in which we're working? Right.
You don't want it to be a checkbox. You want it to be incentive.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit more about, you touched on this a little bit, and I want to dig into it. And the idea of like proxies to measure collaboration and communication. You talked about like, one-on-one time, like a pair programming or an in-person code review, or an active code review, rather than just kicking PRs back and forth through GitHub. That can include things all the way down to like monitoring network traffic just to see those connections. But that starts to kind of feel a little bit big brothery, perhaps. And are we being tracked? And particularly in times of COVID, there's been companies, horrifyingly, who've required employees to install software that how much keyboard time are you spending, that kind of stuff. So what's the balance between being able to have important insights into your development organization, into your engineers' productivity, versus being overly intrusive from the perspective of like job satisfaction and psychological safety and all those other things that are so important?
Yeah, I love this question. Honestly, there's not a great answer here, because anything, to your prior point, anything could be misused, right? We can look at number of commits, we can look at number of pushes, and that can be misused if that's all we have as a productivity metric. In terms of network usage, as kind of a sort of surveillance tech, that can be misused. Honestly, I don't think that's the best way to misuse it, right? In terms of communication, collaboration, I think that has better, interesting uses to help us discover and surface and identify new folks that we might be working with, or new folks that are just past our known collaboration network that we may not realize, right? Like how can we discover new subject matter experts? Who could we discover collaborators that we may not understand or even realize that are just past, right? Like if I always work with the same 3 or 4 people and they maybe work with the same 2 or 3, I may have just like a work cousin network that I just don't quite know about. I think those opportunities are great. And even in terms of like the, communication and collaboration, it also extends to things like discoverability. How can organizations think about information discoverability, code discoverability, knowledge discoverability, and where are the friction points that they can help with? But yeah, in terms of surveillance tech, it really boils down to an organization's culture. Does an organization empower and trust its employees, or are they doing things like stack ranking? And if they empower and trust their employees, you will largely see an organization that generally uses data to try to answer questions to help. Whether or not those questions are well formulated or well structured, you don't know. And that's one of the underlying motivations for writing this paper, is to say, I keep seeing you use these words, and I don't think you understand these words, right? So like, we want to help you do the better thing. If it's a stack rank situation, listen, they're going to pull whatever data they can pull. And like, you can't,
yeah,
no data is going to fix that. What you have to do is help motivate and communicate and articulate why like stack ranking is bad. And it doesn't matter what data they're going to use, they're going to stack rank anyway. So you have to try to like flip the stack rank bit.
So in theory, if you were looking at, for example, a network traffic proxy in a healthy organization, you would see kind of a big lit up blob where there's many points across multiple, or many connections across multiple points. What we probably often see in organizations, there's little clusters of connections within a single team, and then maybe a couple of connections across, right?
Yeah,
So
and in healthy orgs, you see that, and what you often do is you'll notice key people that are connectors, and you find ways to both leverage those people to maximize and accelerate and amplify connections, and make sure that they don't get burned out, that you make sure that they're happy, that you make sure, and you figure out, you find out, you ask questions like, why does everyone talk to this person? Either they're incredibly helpful, they're incredibly happy, they're incredibly wonderful. Also, do they not show up anywhere on something like a contribution graph? And yet they're so essential for information flow, for invisible work, for glue work. In an unhealthy organization, yeah, you can break that in weird ways. Contrast. In an unhealthy organization, you can take any metric and find ways to stack rank someone, whether it's a network graph or lines of code or number of PRs or time cards, right? So I think it really kind of boils down to the company culture and the company incentives.
Let's talk about another kind of key element of this, which is the code review. And we talk about it in the paper, you touch on it in a couple of different ways. From a building an inclusive culture, which is increasingly important. And Lord knows there's a decade's worth of data that says that inclusive organizations are generally more successful, both for longevity and financial reasons. There's a lot of data that shows that certain types of people will give and receive code reviews better than others. I think there's a number of studies that talk about how, for example, women may be reviewed more harshly than men if you know the gender of the code author, that sort of thing. Maybe a person of color might get reviewed more harshly, and this can be exacerbated if you have certain sets of people who are responsible for the majority of your reviews, maybe your senior team. So what do you think about going back to tooling and opportunities to throw money at the problem in useful ways? What about tooling to try and smooth out those types of frictions? For example, anonymizing authors of PR requests, or somehow making the display of technical progression more anonymous as a way of reducing bias, and also providing more opportunities for people to participate in a safe way. Is there any data that shows that those types of efforts are worth investigating for organizational health?
I think there are a lot of opportunities here. I am not the expert in the space. Danae Ford definitely is. I know what I know of the literature. You're right. It's really kind of an interesting and complex situation and complex space where women and underrepresented minorities both receive more harsh reviews, and they receive less positive reviews, less positive language in their reviews, which makes it pretty difficult from a review standpoint and from a performance management standpoint. So from a review standpoint, it's difficult in the open source space. From a performance management standpoint, it's difficult in the enterprise and workplace standpoint. And then if you happen to work somewhere where you're paid to work in open source, it's kind of a double hit.
Right.
I know you can't win for losing. Danae Ford has done some really interesting work, I guess outside of reviews, but in terms of, she did some wonderful work, for example, with Stack Overflow, where they found that investments and efforts to increase inclusion broadly in terms of work that kind of raised the bar or allowed more inclusion and more participation for underrepresented groups actually helped everyone in general, right? So it was very, very cool. And I want to be careful because I'm not as familiar with this paper. I haven't read it recently, but I want to say that, they reached out and they found ways for women and underrepresented groups to feel safer commenting or asking questions. And by doing that, they actually helped everyone. They helped novices across the board. And I think that's particularly interesting to think about because many times at least I personally have come across this reflex from people saying like, well, but is it worth, or what do we think about devoting this many resources toward a group that is underrepresented, right? Like, is this a smart use of resources? And I don't love that reflex, but at least from a perspective, I could understand it, right? Because if you're resource constrained, is that smart? But what much of the research finds is that when you devote resources to underrepresented groups, it does benefit large groups of people who are much more broadly represented. And so when we think about creating tools and creating solutions for folks who are not well served by our tools, for example, code reviews, we can actually benefit much larger groups of people who may not currently be served well and who we may just not be aware that they're not served well. And so I think it's a very, very good opportunity.
To kind of get rid of that tough it out mentality, right?
Yep.
Exactly. No, 100% agree. All right, I think we're about out of time, but I did want to close out as someone who has long been in the industry, kind of watching how it is that we do our work. I'd love to close out with a sort of inside the actor studio style questionnaire.
Yay!
Reflect reflect your responses, brief responses. So what's the best PR review comment you've ever gotten?
LGTM.
Fair enough, fair enough. When trying to debug something, what is your favorite expletive?
Fuck.
An excellent one. John Cleese would agree, I suspect. How many times have you been mansplained on your own research?
I don't think there are numbers for that.
Okay, it's asymptotic. All right. How do you celebrate getting a paper published?
It depends on the outlet. Usually ice cream.
Ice cream is good. Ice cream is good. Yeah. All right. And if you weren't studying how high-tech industry does its job, what would your non-tech dream job be?
Oh gosh. Probably a surgeon.
Ooh, I could see that. Hopefully you would have a lot of ice cream celebrating successful surgeries.
Yes, yes.
All right, thank you so much, Nicole, Dr. Nicole Forsgren, for joining us here at CDCon. It has been a pleasure. Looking forward to seeing the next round of research that you produce on behalf of all of us in high-tech industry. I look forward to it. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me.